thank you all for being here. Also, to those of you who are connecting from afar. My name is Riccardo Alcaro. I am Head of Research at the International Affairs Institute in Rome. I'm also the coordinator of an EU-funded project, Joint, Understanding and Strengthening EU Foreign and Security Policy. And this project provides the occasion for this public event in which we will be discussing EU foreign policy in light of the war in Ukraine. We will not, I guess, go deep into the military details of the conflict. We'll try to take a step back and reflect upon the broader implications of the war for Ukraine, for Europe's order, for global balances of power, and lastly, but certainly not least, for EU integration. With me, discussing these very important issues are four outstanding researchers and experts. We have first Rosa Balfour, who's the director of Carnegie Europe. Rosa is also a member of the advisory board of the Joint Project. Then Bruno Tertrais, who's deputy director of the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique, which is not just a member of the consortium carrying out the Joint Project, is also our host today. Then Medelina Hendytio, which is Deputy Executive Director of the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Jakarta, who will provide us with a much needed non-European perspective of the war and its implications for non-European countries. And finally, Olexiy Haran was a professor of comparative politics at the University of Kyiv, Mohyla Academy. And Olexiy, thanks for being here. We know it's not easy to get out of Ukraine in this moment, and I would like to start with you. And my question is very simple, although the answer might not be that simple. We have seen a change of, we have seen a shift, at least, in the military balance in the conflict. The front has finally moved. Ukraine has carried out a successful, for now, counteroffensive, especially in the east, and it is bringing the fight to the Russians also in the south of the country. So my question would be, what are Ukraine's political objectives right now? What is it that Ukraine realistically hopes to achieve?
Okay, the answer to that, thank you very much. The answer to that actually is simple. So 92% of Ukrainians believe in Ukraine's victory. Okay, so because often you may hear the question from Western audience, at what point Ukrainians would be tired and they would be ready to make concessions. So the answer is here, 92% believe in Ukraine's victory. And when we ask Ukrainians, what does it mean, victory for you? 55% said restoration of borders as of January 2014. 20% of Ukrainians would go even further because they are thinking about, they're dreaming of the defeat of the Russian army and maybe split of Russia. You know, I'm not sure if it's realistic, so it depends on many other factors, but at least for Ukrainians, restoration of territorial integrity, defeat of the Russian army is very, very important. And only 90% are ready to make concessions on Crimea, and 7.5% are ready for concessions to return to the status quo of February 23. So basically, this is the answer to your question. Ukrainians are ready to fight. We pay heavy price for that, but we understand that we are fighting not only for freedom of the country and not only for territorial integrity of Ukraine, we are fighting also for the new country, for democratic country. And we think that this is a fight between democracy and authoritarian. So this is the answer, quick answer to your question.
Thank you, Olexiy. I will now go to Bruno, because this war has been widely perceived as being systemic in nature, at least as far as the European strategic chessboard is concerned. I wanted to ask you first whether you agree with this assessment, and if you do, what kind of order do you think might emerge from this war? What kind of new system or even order is this war designing in Europe? Perhaps.
Yes, hello. Thanks. I think it has become systemic. It is systemic. It has always been systemic, even existential for the Ukrainians. It is becoming systemic for the Europeans. It was not a given 7 months ago, but I think that now it is. Second, I'm not sure that a stable order will emerge from it, even assuming a real clear victory from Ukraine, held by its Western and other allies in France. A radical defeat of Russia would not necessarily mean a stable European order, because a radical defeat of Russia could very well bring some instability in Russia. So can we in Europe remain insulated for whatever comes next in Russia? I'm not entirely certain. I'm afraid that we may have to have some form of cordon sanitaire, as they used to say in the early 20th century, vis-à-vis Russia for a while. I think Russia will need several decades of soul searching, maybe not several decades, but in several years. But I think the only possibility for a stable order after the Ukraine war, that is after Ukrainian victory, means isolation of Russia. I don't see any realistic scenario where there is both stability and Russia in the European system. I wish it could be different. I think this is going to be a trauma for the Russian society. Maybe Russian society needs that trauma, but I'm not sure at all that we will have any kind of stability with Russia anytime soon. Would you like me to develop, or is it just short initial answers?
No, please keep on going.
So I think that being said, you will have, I guess, what's pretty obvious, a bigger NATO, stronger EU. When I say stronger, I mean the fact that we have Denmark now in the European defense policy, that we've made use of the European facility in ways which were not exactly planned for beforehand. Whatever geopolitical Europe means, I don't want to get into this the definitions game once again. I think we will have a more stable and stronger European order apart from Russia. Now, I guess the question is whether the European political community will be an effective vehicle for bringing in former and future EU countries.
You mean Macron's idea?
It was Macron's idea, but it's no longer just Macron's idea. It has been adopted as a concept. Now, what it means, what it will be exactly, remains pretty uncertain. I thought that this was another, Macron is fond of having great ideas, but very bad at selling them. Also, the timing is atrocious most of the time. That's very French and very Macron in particular. Fortunately, he made a great speech at the UN General Assembly, by the way. I've criticized many of his speeches. This one is absolutely fantastic, honestly. Probably one of the best. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Now, what about pan-European systems? I can't imagine the OSCE working properly for several years after what happens next in Russia. And around Russia, the OSTC is already fragmenting. You can see that the Pandora's box of borders, which has been opened courtesy of Vladimir Putin, is clearly something which will not stop being open for a while. I can't imagine that the OSTC will remain a functional, solid alliance system, one which could bring to those who dream of another, whatever, Vienna Congress. I mean, this is farcical. This is not the 20th century. This is not what the first decades of the 20th century will look like. So in a nutshell, I would say, more stability in the West, more instability in the East, a fractured Eurasian continent, and little chance for cooperative security on the Eurasian landmass for some time.
Thank you, and thank you also for providing me the perfect lead-in to the next speaker, Medelina Hendytio from CSIS. So I said before that a perspective on this war, which is not rooted in Europe or the United States, is much needed because we hear too little of that. So my first question would be almost natural. What's your perspective of this war? What's Indonesia's perspective of this war and other countries in the region's assessment of the Ukraine war?
Thank you, Riccardo, for the question. I'd like to address that question from 3 points of view. The first one is the lens US NATO rivalry with Russia. I think is less relevant in explaining how East Asia countries think about the war. It might be relevant for Northeast Asia countries that geographically closer to Russia, but less so for Southeast countries. You might think that despite of bilateral ties with Russia, and also Russia is the dialogue partner of ASEAN, but it's not Russia is not really an existing power in the region. This the first views. The second, I think, is more relevant lens is about we're talking about sovereignty and international law as well as norms. In the region, we might find countries that oppose Russia invasion to Ukraine and agree to give sanction and condemnation to Russia, even exclusion to Russia. But the main argument is because they point out the importance of maintaining sovereignty and law and international order. And Russia has been seen as breach this international order and also sovereignty. The current world order is founded in the idea of the sovereignty and integrity of states, which acknowledge the centrality of states and the value of non-intervention or interference to the internal affairs. But countries in a neutral position or who are less eager to express rejection to Russia decision in invade war cannot be automatically accused as violating, accused as support law and order violation. We should understand about the interplay factors that explaining entirely countries' diplomatic action, to respond the issues. And I think all similar reaction. The similar response is because the default position result in strategic, what we call strategic autonomy position. So referring to international law and sovereignty, as well as no mention policy, are rooted in the country's efforts to, as much as possible, to be a neutral. And I think the last point is perhaps it's not upper, but it's very interesting to discuss. It's about the sentiment, anti-American sentiment, because this group, there's perspective is very clear, is pro-Russia, and the argument is because Russia action is willing to stand up against U.S. hypocrisy, because people, this group views that American applies double standard. We can question about the similar, what's the difference between Russia action with US against war in Iraq, and US policies in Middle East who support Israel and refuse to apply to a nation solution for Palestinian. And surprisingly, these groups are quite strong in Indonesia, especially among the non-government organization and also youngsters. This support is not translated into political action like demonstration, but they are very active through social media. So I think it's very evident. So I stop.
And are these groups capable of shaping the debate about the war in Indonesia and elsewhere? Is something the government has to take account of?
Yes, I think this also the things that now government consider, before they give reaction or response to the war. I mean, and also, it's in Indonesia, it's very special case because this close to general election, presidential election. So I think this issue is also very interesting. So now the government also consider this development, into government position in expressing reaction toward the war.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we will definitely get back to some of the points you mentioned, especially the fact that outside of Europe, the kind of reactions other countries have towards the war involve their consideration not just about principles of international law and sovereignty and territorial integrity and non-interference. They also, of course, imply what their considerations are with regard to their relationship with Russia, but critically with the United States too. And we will get back to that. But before going to Washington, I would like to go back to Brussels and to Europe and specifically Brussels, because my next interlocutor is Rosa Balfour. I mean, you are an expert in EU politics, EU integration, and I wonder what your first assessment, well, not first assessment, 7 months old assessment of the EU response to the war is, and where you think this response is putting, I mean, in what direction is this response putting the EU on?
Thank you very much, Riccardo. Thank you for inviting me here. So I think 2 points. 2 points that lead me to think that the type of response is historic. So it's not like the responses that we've seen in the past 15 years. Okay, so it is a game-changing period, and we have to think about what the trajectory is. The first is strategic, actually, and I think we shouldn't forget that. It's about how European governments, European institutions view Russia, and I think we have seen a real shift. It's not just a response to events. It is a real shift in the sense that whereas we've had a political and corporate mainstream that viewed Russia as a partner, now we have a political and corporate mainstream that views Russia as a challenge, an enemy. I mean, you can, different shades of what that view is, but a country not to be trusted under the present leadership. And that is a game-changing shift, because it changes the balance in the relationships among European states. Because before there used to be quite a big rift between those who had a disenchanted view of Russia, often determined by history, and therefore were advocating more hawkish policies, and those who had a more benign view of Russia and who were advocating partnership, engagement, dialogue, etc., etc. That rift is less narrow now. The second element that changes the picture is the fact that the response by necessity is a whole of government response. it's not just limited to foreign and security policy. So now we're going through that big debate about energy and what type of solidarity, what type of mechanisms can be put in place to guarantee energy solidarity. It's very complicated. It might not go as far as some who would like to see a greater integration in the energy market. It might not go that far, but nonetheless, the debate has changed completely. And it's not just energy, so it's security policy, military policy. Again, plenty of taboos have been broken. Finance, economics, humanitarian support, migration, energy, you name it. And all these whole of government approaches require rethinking how we finance it. And that, again, will be a game-changing moment. So I think these are, I suppose, the two main reasons for which I think we are in a different place compared to 2014 after the annexation of Crimea, compared to the whole Syria, the civil war in Syria, Libya, you name it. We've had a long period of foreign policy crises, and even compared to the whole Eurozone crisis and the migration crisis, 2015, 2016. So in that sense, we're in a different place.
May I just raise the finger here, because I agree with you that the kind of response the EU put up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine is in stark contrast with what we saw in the early 2010s when the Eurozone crisis unleashed its destructive potential, especially in Southern Europe, and when the EU member states some years later in 2014, 15, 16 basically could agree on nothing when it came to address the so-called refugee crisis. But there was another crisis in between, those two crises, which were very bad crises for the EU and the kind of response it gave, and the current crisis, which is the COVID crisis. Do you see any continuity between the COVID crisis, the EU response to COVID, and the EU response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Do you think that there might even be, it can even be argued that somehow the kind of response the EU gave to the COVID crisis made it easier for the EU to respond to the Russia crisis the way it has?
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, what the COVID crisis showed, and the type of response, again, which was allow the Commission to borrow, is basically the key ingredient that allows the EU to look at this in a different way. And I think I think the two go hand in hand. I'm not entirely sure, had there not been a COVID crisis, that we would have seen this type of response, to be honest. So I think it is, yeah, you're perfectly right. The two need to be seen together.
Well, yes, I mean, all this makes me think about how we should frame EU integration in light of the Ukraine crisis. But before elaborating more on this topic, I would like to go back to you, Olexiy, because
and I don't like the words Ukraine crisis. Let's call it war. Russia's war against Ukraine. Because previously, before 2022, it was called crisis, conflict, it was war since 2014. Sorry for that.
It was always a war in Ukraine and a crisis in Russia. Now it's a bigger thing.
Yeah.
Ukraine is now at the center of international politics. But this war will end one day. And at that stage, perhaps, we will have a difficult moment in terms of where to place Ukraine. And in order to discuss about that, I would like to start from where Ukraine sees itself in in Europe's future system. And I'm not talking in terms of its ideal position, but in terms of what it realistically hopes to achieve, even in steps. We know that for some time after the invasion, Ukraine was fine with the idea of renouncing, for instance, its membership bid, its NATO membership bid, if certain conditions were met. I guess the counteroffensive has made that point completely moot at this stage. I think that Ukraine's NATO membership is back in the game. So I would like to hear from you what's your personal assessment, or perhaps what you think Ukraine's current government thinks it may achieve in the midterm.
Thank you so much for all these wonderful questions. I would like to stress not only what Ukrainian government says, but what also Ukrainian society says, because it's really important. The government in Ukraine cannot sustain without support from below. And first of all, I would like to express the gratitude from all the Ukrainians to those countries which supported Ukraine in the fight against Russian aggression. And we know that 141 countries denounced Russian aggression, including Indonesia. So we are really thankful for that. Now, regarding the future of Ukraine. Look, before 2014, Ukrainians were quite naive or pragmatic because they thought that we can live in friendship both with the EU and Russia. And many Ukrainians wanted to have association agreement with the EU, but at the same time, to have very good relations with Russia and Belarus. But after 2014, the whole dynamic changed. So you see it very easily. In red, those who supported union with Russia, after 2014, it collapsed totally. Now, about NATO. Before 2014, supporters of NATO, like myself, they were always in minority. 13% in 2012. Most Ukrainians were in favor of non-bloc status. And actually, before 2014, Ukraine officially was non-bloc country. So when Putin is saying, I started the annexation of Crimea and the going Donbass because we needed to prevent NATO expansion, come on, Ukrainians didn't want to be in NATO. But after 2014, it skyrocketed, and now it's even more. So it's about 80%. Now, let's coming back to how realistic it is. Yes, when Russian aggression started after full-scale war started after February 24th, there was discussion. We don't know exactly how it was discussed in Istanbul, but we can have some ideas that Ukrainian government was considering non-bloc, non-NATO option, but with guarantees, with real guarantees, not paper type guarantees like with Budapest Memorandum of 1994, and you know pretty well that at that time Ukraine had the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, British, French, and Chinese combined together. And we gave it up in exchange for territorial guarantees from the US, UK, and ironically, Russia. Okay? So when Russian aggression started in 2014, we understood that we need to have real guarantees. So again, after February 24th, there was a quite short period, I would say, by the end of March, when we were considering this option, including myself, but we were saying, give us real guarantees, and we can be outside of NATO. Now the situation, I think the situation actually both changed and didn't change. So we understand that at this point, the Western countries are not ready to invite Ukraine to NATO. NATO countries are not providing non-fly zone over Ukraine. NATO countries didn't supply anti-air missile defense system to Ukraine until recently, at least. So, what is now is discussing. We have a kind of blueprint made by the commission, which is called Yermak Rasmussen Commission, and it's discussing the security guarantees to Ukraine. But these security guarantees include supply of weapons, economic sanctions, training of Ukrainian army, not direct involvement of NATO members in the war in Ukraine. So this is a step number one. Okay, so we will see how this diplomatic process will develop. We understand now that the real guarantee of Ukrainian security is Ukrainian army. But Ukrainian army needs to be trained, armed, and we need here international support. But again, we think that this is not enough. Okay, so the long-term goal, joining NATO, remains. And now our government actually listens to what public society, public opinion is saying, and public opinion is strongly in favor of NATO. So we can divide it in steps. Steps number one,
Guaranteed.
without military NATO intervention, okay, but supply of weapons, training, sanctions, and all this thing. And in future, step number two, joining NATO.
Olexiy, wait a second, because Bruno had to bring
Because
the-
I would like also to react what was said about the third world
Just-
countries and
I mean,
global.
I will go back to you,
Okay,
but I think Bruno had two fingers on something you said.
It's not actually to challenge you, it's to actually reinforce your point. I think it has become realistic for many Western countries to give security guarantees separately from NATO. I mean, the Rasmussen
Yes,
group's
correct.
proposal is one thing. It will not be necessarily exactly implementing this particular group's proposal, but the idea of something in between being a member of NATO and just a partner and being a full-fledged member is something that I think is increasingly being considered as something realistic and desirable. The only question is, it all depends on whatever medium to long-term settlement exists at the end of the war. If it's, as we all hope, a complete recovery of Ukraine's territorial integrity, then it will be easier. If it's not, it may be more difficult. But at least the concept is, I think, increasingly being discussed. By the way, Finland and Sweden were given temporary security guarantees, in a sense, before the accession is actually legally binding. So that's already some kind of example, in a sense.
Thank you. Olexiy, back to you.
So if we are talking about global consequences of the war, what is the difference? As I have said, all this argument about NATO expansion and Americans, trying to seize Ukraine, this wasn't the case. What is really important in global implication of that is that we see that nuclear country is attacking non-nuclear country, which gave up its nuclear weapons and trying to annex its territory. This is unprecedented, right? This is unprecedented. Now, there were no annexations in Europe since World War II. No annexations since World War II. Kosovo, Northern Cyprus, these are not, classical types of annexation. And what Putin is doing actually, annexation. Now, never ever in history, foreign power seized nuclear power plants. Never ever. This is for the first time. First Chernobyl, then Zaporizhzhia, and now you have attacks on other nuclear power plants. And also now you have a food crisis. You have a food because Ukrainian ports are blocked. Ukrainian grain export is blocked. And again, now we have an agreement. But by the one hand, Russians are saying, okay, we are letting you go with your grain export. And by the other hand, they are sending missiles to Ukraine. So the food crisis will continue. Moreover, if anything happens at nuclear power plants, you can imagine what would be the consequences for the whole region because of radiation to the Middle East, and how the food crisis would be aggravated for the whole world, So really you have unprecedented situation in the world.
Yeah, you are really providing me with easy leadings to the next questions I wanted to ask, because I wanted to get back to Medelina, I asked her about not just the perception of East Asia and Southeast Asia in particular of the Ukraine war, but what the implications for this region are. I'm not talking about broad strategic or geopolitical alignments. I'm talking about more practical day-to-day difficulties people in these countries may have met because of the war, and especially because of the food crisis it created.
Yeah, thank you, Riccardo. For Southeast Asia country, it's very clear that their position, reaction are diverse, from the spectrum of condemning to the constant abstaining. So this reflect, the difficulties also, in Southeast Asia countries' reaction. And this can be explained from two perspectives. The first one is that the country situated in different allies. Some countries some countries have close ties to Russia, and close ties to others are close ties to US and its allies. But as you asking, about the day-to-day life of the people, I think is also has been mentioned before, that the impact to the economic aspect of the war is very, very clear. Government in developing country at the moment, are concentrated their economic effort to economic recovery after the pandemic, and also dealing with the consequences of climate change. But now with the destruction of the supply chains, then the food price is rising dramatically, and also oil and fuel, it's trigger demonstration in Indonesia, because the fact is the government cannot afford anymore to provide oil subsidy for oil, because it's the concentration to the economic recovery that I mentioned. But this really, difficult for the life of the people. And we remember that President Jokowi visited Ukraine and Russia, not only bringing the peace message, but specifically, asking, bringing the people concerned on how the supply chains can be back to normal, because to avoid, deeper economic crisis.
Yeah, thank you, Medelina. So I think we have almost exhausted the first part of the debate, and I want to engage people from the audience. But before that, I would like to put on the table a proposition on which I want Bruno and Rosa to respond. And that concerns the direction of EU integration. As Rosa was saying before, and Bruno, you also mentioned that, this war has created a demand or a need, and also a demand, at least at the level of elites and certain segments of the public, for more Europe, more integration, more cooperation on the migration front, on the energy front. There will be a need to finance, to respond to the economic consequences of the war within the EU, and to finance Ukraine's reconstruction, and a need to finance also the further enlargement rounds that the EU now envisages. And that will involve probably a new shot at borrowing from the Commission. So there is also demand for greater defense spending, and also more rationalization of military spending. So there is the possibility, the real chance, that one of the unintended consequences of the war will be a more integrated EU. But at the same time, it's not given, there are several variables, but there is at least a demand for that, or at least a need, a clearer need for that. But at the same time, what the war has also laid bare dramatically is how dependent Europe is on the United States. The security guarantees that the US extends to EU member states were always of critical importance, but now, at least for the countries closest to Russia's border, they really have taken on again an existential nature. So, and while Europe is winding down its energy reliance on Russia, its energy reliance on the US is growing, and also on supplies from countries that are closely aligned with the US, like the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, or Saudi Arabia, or even the likes of Egypt and Israel. So we might have a scenario in which this war will have made Europe more integrated, and to an extent stronger, but not more autonomous. Do you think this is actually a realistic scenario, or what's your take on this view? Who wants to start? You, Bruno? Rosa?
I'm happy either way.
Okay, I think we have to be very careful with the words that we use. I'm not sure I would agree with the suggestion that it's obvious for all Europeans that the Ukraine war leads to a demand for a more integrated Europe. I think it's true for part of the elites.
I did say at the level of elites,
That's
certain segments of the public.
Then I would agree with you. It's certainly, so that's point one. Point two, it does suggest that most Europeans will be happy to spend more on defense in general, but that's not necessarily more Europe. I think it does clarify the role of the Commission. I mean, the Commission has proven that it was willing and able to exercise a leadership role on the question of sanctions in particular. That was very clear, and I think also very welcome. I mean, counterfactuals are always difficult, but who knows what would have happened with a different person at the head of the Commission, with a different person in the White House. I mean, there are many counterfactuals, especially possible. Don't forget that we may end up after this winter thinking, among the things that need maybe more reform than more integration is energy policy, because I think that it would not be fair to blame Russia 100% for the high prices of energy. I mean, our energy policy, from what I understand, because I'm not an expert, is in shambles. So that's also another aspect of things. And to go back to one aspect of things that I know better, you're right. At least temporarily, it's a Europe that is more dependent, or at least equally dependent on the United States than it was before. But wait a minute, two problems. I'm not going to go back to the old debate about what autonomy is. It's not only about. I think today it's mostly not about defense. Okay, so it's reducing reliance on a single country. I think we are reducing our reliance on Russia for energy. We're not reducing our reliance on the United States. But there's a problem. Well, two problems. I was in NATO 2 days ago, and to have a conversation with the ambassadors and the reps. And one of the messages that I drew, without getting into the substance of the conversation, is that there is very clear pressure from the United States to make the Europeans understand that the reinforcements are temporary for a number of reasons, including readiness. So our Central European friends need reassurance, need more defense, and I get that. But they should not think that it will be a given, even if we continue to have a president which is sympathetic to Europe's defense needs, which will not always be the case. I remember having this discussion during the last year of the Trump presidency, and Jim Mattis kept saying, in Vilnius, Riga, Warsaw, and elsewhere, don't look at what he says, look at what I do. Yeah, but that's not good enough, because it takes a tweet to break NATO. I mean, the credibility of NATO as a deterrent. So bottom line, and that's even before we start talking about Taiwan. So I think the bottom line is, it's very simple. I call it the win-win-win situation. I mean, spending more on defense is good for national defense, it's good for European defense, it's good for NATO defense. So whatever happens next across the Atlantic or in Brussels or among us, we will need to have strong national defense capabilities. That's pretty much the bottom line. But it's true that so far we are not reducing our reliance on the United States. And I think that if that reassures Europe and if that deters Russia, then it's good. But let's try to also think what happens 5 to 10 years from now. One last point, I apologize for being too long. One last point which I think is important. Don't underestimate the argument that you will hear in Europe, in some quarters of Europe, and that you already hear also in some quarters of the United States, according to which, hey, Russia is much weaker than we thought. We don't really need to increase our defense spending. That argument you can already see and hear and read it across Europe, and I'm told also in the United States. So even though I'm sure that in this room it's, we're most of us, I guess, or at least some of us are sympathetic to the idea that we will need to increase our national defense efforts. We should not, once again, getting back to my initial point, we should not take for granted what we take for granted. I apologize for being too long.
No problem. Actually, that's a very good point. Rosa.
Yeah, let me start with the autonomy question in a sort of relational way. I agree with Bruno. I mean, we were dependent on the US for foreign and security policy. I think even the response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine actually demonstrates that the leadership, I mean, the EU pressed all the right buttons, but the leadership was coming from Washington. I mean, let's not fool ourselves that, all of a sudden the EU became this amazing actor who could, target sanctions. It was the leadership and the strategy came very much from Washington, even if the Commission and the member states responded with extraordinary speed and competence. And so, yes, that we're certainly seeing that. And it might be something sustainable in the short term because of the 2024 election. So I think it's really important at this stage, given that, in terms of security and defense, we're not talking about an autonomous EU for a generation. We're not talking about an autonomous EU for a generation. Therefore, I think it's actually quite important to embed that relationship in such a way that it cannot be undone with a tweet. It cannot be undone through executive order. But the second point I'd like to make is that, we had dependencies with Russia as well, and with China. I mean, the German business model was based on cheap energy imports and exports to China. And that is over. And that's the big shift. And that's where the EU really needs to focus its attention. I mean, yes, progress on defense, fine. But that's not necessarily what the EU is about. It's about everything else. And, so the business model that Germany had supported, promoted, and as the largest economy in the EU, it affected all the other member states. That needs to be rethought. And that's where the EU comes in, and it's not just about NATO. So the autonomy piece, in the relational dimension is complicated. And we're certainly seeing, I think, a shift towards the transatlantic relationship. I mean, usually when similar questions are asked, my soundbite is the West is solidifying, but it's shrinking because the rest of the world is not necessarily following through. And I think that is a big problem. It's a question of bandwidth, it's a question of resources, and we talked about, how much will be needed in terms of resources to address all the challenges, energy, defense, etc. You also need to have a global diplomatic. You need to make a global diplomatic effort to support the global South. For one thing, at least for one thing, to support the global South in the green transition, because that is what the future is actually about. So I'd say, that would be my short answer. What was the next bit? What was the direction of travel?
Yeah, well, my point, my provocation was that we might well see a stronger EU in the sense of either a more integrated EU or an EU which is more cooperative and equipped with greater capacity, including in the defense sector, but not only in the defense sector, also in energy and other policy areas. But that will not necessarily translate into greater autonomy on the part of the EU, because actually what I'm gathering from your ideas is that the EU will remain and actually will work in a direction which will basically solidify its link with the United States, but according to the same power differential we see now, which is an asymmetric relationship. And therefore, I see less room for the EU to pursue separate paths on relations with China or with Iran, for instance, as for a time it was attempted by at least some member states. I see the room for misalignment with the US on the global stage for Europe much reduced, and I think the costs of that misalignment have increased, and the incentives of alignment have instead increased.
I mean, I think what would Washington like to see with the current administration is a Europe, and it doesn't matter under what, whether it's EU or whether it, it doesn't matter what the institutional format, but a Europe that is more capable of taking on certain responsibilities and more aligned with the US when the US moves to focusing back on the Indo-Pacific and in particular on China. And that's what's going to happen, regardless of who wins the 2024 election. So, but there is, the idea is that there is some kind of alignment. I think from the European perspective, the big problem is the degree to, and this is a very old debate, the degree to which Europe decides to become a regional power or a global power. And so if it's a regional power that pursues greater integration but is more autonomous from the rest of the world, I don't think it's actually in the EU's DNA, the way in which the EU has been constructed, which is very much through trade, it's very much through projecting global regulation. And what it doesn't have is a foreign policy that matches the global reach that it has on other themes. So I think there's a bit of a dilemma there. If you pursue greater integration with a more inward-looking narrative, in this case, we have the enemy to promote that narrative. Is it at the expense of the rest of the world? And I think there's a dilemma, both in terms of foreign and security policy, but also in terms of what are the sort of global norms and principles that we want the EU to embrace. So far, they've actually been sort of internationalist principles. We want to promote peace, we want to promote international norms. Is that sustainable with another model which would be more inward looking? The fortress model evolved post Russian war in Ukraine, fortress model Europe, and I think that dilemma is still there.
May I add on Ukraine EU?
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Well, for many years, the EU was teaching Ukrainians what does it mean to be democratic. Now we are not teaching, but we are showing to the EU what does it mean to defend, fight, and die for democratic principles and values. And that's very good that the EU finally understood the role of Ukrainians, that Ukrainians are European nations. So I think it was very important to hear during the first day of aggression from Ursula von der Leyen that you are one of us. This was really important, and definitely the candidate status for the EU. So again, we are thankful to all EU countries which supported it, including France, including Germany, which were hesitating for some time, as always, but finally said yes. Okay, and we know that being candidate is one thing, negotiations may last for many years, but nevertheless, this is already a powerful tool for domestic Ukrainian transformation. It's already working, because as I have said, we are fighting for the new country. The civil society in Ukraine now, again, is incredibly strong. And after the victory, they would like to change the country. So having candidate status is important now. So thanks again.
Thank you. So what I gather from all this is that this war has created the potential for the European Union and other arrangements connected to the European Union, be them NATO or the European political community, the bilateral relationship would be or with acceding member states, may become a more powerful, more effective instrument of organizing intercontinental relationships. What I still have very much, what I still have a lot of doubts about is the ability of the EU to emerge as a foreign policy player capable of pursuing a foreign policy course on a global level, especially when that policy course is not well appreciated or opposed or resisted in other forms in Washington. That's my final, I mean, my assessment. Now we have still a lot of time for questions and comments from the audience. Zach, you first.
Thanks very much, Riccardo, and thank you to all the panelists.
You may introduce yourself before.
Yes, indeed. My name is Zach Bacon, and I'm a researcher at the Center for European Policy Studies, or CEPS, in Brussels, and we are the organization that is leading Work Package 6 of the joint project. I have one observation and one question. I'm wondering if just Olexiy could maybe go back to the slide that he had up before about different security preferences among the Ukrainian population, because I think that the distinction that you made between population and government is a significant one. What I see from looking at this chart right here is that in 2008, when after the Bucharest summit, NATO declared Ukraine will become a member of NATO, popular support for joining NATO in Ukraine at that time was only 15 or 20%. Now, I think that reveals a great deal about liberal internationalism and the structure of the liberal international order itself, and how the liberal norm of national self-determination expresses itself. Because Ukraine's right to join NATO, its so-called right to choose, is often described as being an extension of the right of national self-determination, which is the fundamental norm of the liberal international order. And yet that national self-determination obviously was not expressing itself at the time through popular support for that choice. So obviously that does, say a great deal about how rival powers might have viewed liberal hegemony and the way that it, manifested itself at the time. There's another parallel right now with a poll that just came out that showed that despite being an official candidate country, support for joining the EU and Serbia was only at 1/3 among the population, which is a significant revolution. Just an observation to make. My question is for Bruno, however.
I have actually response.
I look forward to it. My question is for Bruno. In your opening response, you mentioned that the only path to relative stability, let's say, in the European security order is through the isolation of Russia. I wonder can you be a little bit more specific and tangible about what isolating Russia specifically might entail? I mean, in many respects, Russia is not isolated today. It's certainly not isolated from the rest of the world in terms of sanctions, in terms of diplomacy, etc. And, like it or not, but, Russia will remain the most populous country in Europe. It's going to have thousands of nuclear weapons trained on Europe. So it's part of the European security order, whether we like it or not. So what does that mean, isolated specifically from Europe? And how do you isolate a great power in an integrated world?
So before we move back to the panelists, I would like to have another questions. Christy from the back.
Thank you, Christy, from the Estonian Campus Institute at ICDS. And actually continuing from the same issue that Jack was also picking up on the European security order, and it might emerge after as a result of the Russia's war against Ukraine. I actually very much agree with Bruno's argument that we cannot have a common European security order that is based on a common understanding with Russia for many years to come, because we just don't have the common basis for that. And I also agree with the point that kind of as a result of this disagreement and admitting that we don't have a common order with Russia, Europeans are actually strengthening their order without Russia. But then where I was a bit puzzled with Bruno's point was about cordon sanitaire. This is the concept you used, and I don't think it has worked very well in European history. And I also don't see it actually growing or even being maintained today. So on the contrary, both the EU and NATO are enlarging. And we see that no European neighbor of Russia wants to be in a buffer zone. Definitely, they don't want to be in the sphere of influence of Russia, and that's why they don't want to be in the buffer zone, because Russia has the tendency to try to include every country that is kind of neutral or not belonging here to alliance to its own sphere of influence. So you could maybe expand a bit on what you meant by that. And this is related to the discussion you had on NATO and security guarantees to Ukraine and also to Finland and Sweden, how they are on the way to join NATO. I think we should be very clear here that you can't actually have security guarantees outside NATO that are as strong as the ones provided by NATO to its members. So we should not kind of create any ambiguity there. And of course, Finland and Sweden are very happy to have the intermediate solution, but this is not something they would want to have permanently. They want full membership, and that also makes this whole question of what kind of security guarantees Ukraine might have in the future a very tricky one. I just can't see any possible solutions other than NATO membership that would really provide proper security guarantees. In the Rasmussen report that came out, I didn't think it was that constructive.
No, I agree with you. Yes, I agree with you.
Okay, if another question over there, young lady there. Yes, please.
So I actually have a question for you.
Could you please identify yourself?
So I'm Asha and so the question that I have is we've been talking a lot about, let's say, foreign policy, but how there is going to be possibly an integrated foreign policy in the EU, let's say, after the war. The question that I have is how long do you think that is possible with the unanimous voting that the EU has on foreign policy? Is that something that, will there be a concrete foreign policy as long as we have unanimous voting?
And the country is from Ukraine.
Okay, Paul, let's go back to the panelists, and then we'll make another round of questions. And please, I urge you also on expanding your outlook and try to solicit some reflections about what the global implications or extra European implications of this war are, because there are serious implications and they will be very important and impactful on Europe too. So, Olexiy, your first.
Yes, Zach, you're right, and I have said that for decades, actually, Ukrainians were trying to have a middle way between Russia and the West. Whatever Putin is saying, we were trying to find the middle way, and it didn't work. But yes, say 2007. Most were in favor of non-bloc status, and at that time, yes, our government decided to push for membership action plan. Was it right in this approach? Well, there are many cases in history when elites are moving forward with some security ideas, and the popular opinion is lagging behind. One example is Spain. We remember how Mr. Solana, when he was a Spanish politician, was against it. Against joining NATO, and we know that, if I'm not mistaken, the referendum on NATO was conducted a year after Spain joined NATO, because at that time they had already background for this popular support, not before. So we can remember how West Germany joined NATO. Also, it was basically split. Main opposition party, Social Democrats, were in favor of neutrality. So there are many cases like this. Regarding now it coincides, and I think this is good. The government approach coincides with the public perception. Regarding what Christy Wright said, yes, you are right, definitely. What we have from this Yermak Rasmussen dialogue and this kind of memo, it's not clear. Again, it's very vague at this point. And actually, it also can only give Ukraine the possibility to be prepared for the next Russian phase of aggression, right? But not to be defended by NATO countries. Okay, so this is only one step forward towards better equipped Ukrainian army. The other option outside of NATO is bilateral treaty, like South Korea and or Japan has with the United States. It could be an option, but again, we are not sure that the United States would agree to that. So we do not exclude it. We do not exclude bilateral security treaties, but definitely the long-term aim would be NATO. I fully agree with you.
Okay. Bruno, you want to respond to Zach's comments about how can we build a sustainable order without Russia?
Yeah, actually, I want to respond to the different comments. Security guarantees are based on credibility. And I think there's a psychological element which is fundamental here. A silver lining of the past 7 months is that Ukraine is now felt as being part of the European family. You're like us, if I may.
Yeah.
And that's something which is a non-trivial psychological dimension when you talk about security, the future security. Credibility is, does the other thing that we would be ready to defend? Yeah, you are more ready to defend that particular country if it is felt that it quote belongs to the family. I mean, this is painted with a very broad brush, obviously. As far as saying that NATO guarantees, there's no stronger guarantee than NATO. I disagree with that. I think that the strongest guarantee is the US security guarantee, whether it's bilateral or NATO. So if you imagine the US, the UK, France, Germany, Poland, for instance, giving together or separately a form of security guarantee to Ukraine, I think it's pretty much in the eye of the adversary. I think it's pretty much as valid as a formal 30-nation NATO guarantee. On the question of isolation, I think that in most scenarios, not all of them, we will need to isolate Russia because Russia will be the sick man of Europe for a while, not for a century, but for a while. Not isolate Russia from the world, of course, but isolate it from Europe. I mean, Russia is leaving Europe. I mean, it will be for historians to decide, but maybe, just maybe, we are witnessing the end of a historical cycle that started in the early 17th century. I mean, maybe. I mean, it's a hypothesis. So whether Russia is, in all scenarios, a key part of the European quote-unquote security order is now debatable. I think it's now debatable. Of course, I'm not trying to give you any certainties here. I think the magnitude of the changes we are witnessing, we are undergoing, we are living, is such that it's very difficult to think through the next 5 years. But I think there are good grounds to say that Russia is leaving Europe, right? Because it's a workable hypothesis. Now, as far as the expression cordon sanitaire, I withdraw it. I know that for anyone who knows his or her history knows it's a bad expression. Would you like an iron curtain instead? It's not so good either. So, I mean, I prefer talking about isolation ward, but we need the patient to heal. It will take a while, but meanwhile, we don't want it to poison us.
NATO-Russia militarized border, would that be okay?
It's not a question of being okay or not. It's an inevitable fact of life, unfortunately.
Yeah. Rosa, the question about...
I mean, the only question will be for cross-border local transit, like in Norway or in Finland, can we still have, or in Kirkenes, will we still have local, people-to-people contact, and can you still go and buy cigarettes, that sort of thing? It's a relatively minor question.
Rosa, there was a question about EU foreign policy decision-making procedures.
Yeah, just to add on to this, I mean, this sort of Iron Curtain versus cordon sanitaire, I mean, there's an assumption that Russia will remain a unitary state, and there's no guarantee that that's happening, and there's already trouble in the periphery, Armenia, Azerbaijan, there's trouble.
Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan.
Exactly. So, and I think actually, if this were to become a trend, that's when Europe might start revising its positions, because one of the sort of motivating factors in the 1990s for trying to stabilize, to try to appease Russia, was also about stabilizing the Eurasian continent. And then the second piece that we haven't talked about is China, and whether actually Russia is preparing to become a sort of junior partner to China, and what that means and what China thinks, etc., etc. Okay, that's another big question. We can leave that for another event. On QMV, so I have to say that I am perhaps in a minority of people who actually thinks that QMV is not going to be a game changer, in the sense it's not going
QMV being
the qualified majority voting. It's not. So I mean, that's a technical point. It's a means. Unanimity exists in foreign policy because issues are too complicated and there are too many divergent interests. If you change the decision-making system, you're not going to change the divergent interests. Those are going to stay. So I don't see that as the way to solving the issue. And I have to say that every time, you know, Schultz mentioned it the other day in the speech in Prague, and it's just, you know, let's go to the heart of things. Obviously, when we look forward, and you know, those who followed my work, I've always been in favor of enlargement, of a good enlargement, of an enlargement which means democratic transformation, etc., etc. And of course, you know, now with having given membership prospect to Ukraine, Moldova, and potentially Georgia, the next piece is, well, we need to work harder, double down on the Balkans, so that we can set some good examples and try and look at how the process can become from a stagnating one a successful one, you know, that builds democracy, builds alignment on foreign policy, etc., etc. But obviously, saying that means that we would have even more votes on foreign policy matters in a broader region, which will have even more divergent interests, because you know these derive from history, from geography, etc., etc. So the question really is how to move forward on that. But I think the time frame is such, except, you know, I mean, if the EU were really smart, it would roll a red carpet with sticks and carrots for Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Albania. So, you know, we could have in a few years' time a real prospect of 3 more members joining, and you would have the sticks also towards a country such as Serbia, which is totally misaligned with respect to foreign policy issues, and you would have, you know, neighbors of Serbian countries who become Eurosceptic and are no longer interested in joining, or claim to be no longer interested in joining the EU because they are dissatisfied with what the EU has done. But they'll see their friends and cousins in Montenegro have a better life, and maybe they'll think twice about who they vote into power. But yeah, so obviously, you know, but looking forward, we're not talking about something that is necessarily going to work the way it's worked so far. We might look at, you know, Macron's idea of diversified, you know, differentiated integration. There could be, you know, there's the European political community. I mean, in terms of institutional architecture, there are all sorts of new things happening, which could offer frameworks and formats whereby foreign policy is actually handled in a different way. So it might not necessarily be in a centralized European Union doing CFSP with 35 members all agreeing unanimously that this is the right thing to do, but it might be with different types of, you know, different types of agreements and alliances that, you know, some countries might look a bit more into Middle East and others into Latin America, etc. And Europe's real power is projected more at the sort of global level, the normative level, the regulatory level, etc. Trade. So, I mean, that's just one scenario, but I just think we shouldn't assume that what will come will be similar to what has happened so far.
Thank you, Rosa. So I have 3 people here, and I would also like to remind those of, people following us from afar, that they can write down a question in the comment section of the Zoom link, and it will be read out. So I have Paul, Christina, and Tim.
Thank you for this wonderful panel. I'm Paul Vargas, fellow listener here at CSIS. I have a question mostly for Bruno and Laura. So at the level of the elite, there is certainly a real shift in integration, European integration, because of course, a security problem like a war. But this war has its effects. It has its crisis, energy crisis, economic crisis, food crisis. how is the European public going to react to all these crises in the coming years? And whether the gap between the discourse of what should be done and the elite and the public, whether it will not widen this gap with the coming crisis in the next years.
It is just good that we in this project we are going also to work on public perceptions. Christina.
Thank you for your great interventions. I'm Christina Couch with the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Zooming out on the broader global impact of the Ukraine war, I'm wondering whether you could talk a little bit about how the Ukraine war has shaped the way China is perceived in the West among the transatlantic allies. Not only perceived, but also how it has impact on China policy, and in particular, how or what reactions would you expect in the case of a Chinese aggression on Taiwan if it happened tomorrow?
Easy question. Timmy.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Timmy from the Institute for Business Credit Studies of Roma. Thank you very much, panelists, for the interesting conversation. That spot is something kind of thinking that would make me want us to, as Riccardo encouraged us to, broaden the view a bit. Now, one of the panelists alluded to the fact that the exposure of Russia's actual defense might is a bit questionable, and it has brought about conversations whether the West really needs to increase defense budgets and so on. This channeled my thoughts towards something I would like the panelists to respond to. And this is it. If that thinking is applied to the way African countries, EU member states, approach peace building, a lot of them do not spend their state funds on peace building. Rather, they do other things. And then when peace and security issues come up, they then look towards the EU or the US for intervention. Do African countries really need to do that? What's the direction of state funds? Where is it going? If the EU is beginning to think do we really need to increase budget? If that same logic is applied to the EU foreign and security policy towards African states, what would that mean for many of the initiatives that the EU is funding? And it's such that we have countries that spend their money on spend these funds on. You see a lot on security goals. A lot goes into security goals. And Nigeria, my country, for example, there are a lot of peace and security challenges that require more attention that is not given. So if that same logic, I'm seeing this as one of the future impacts of the Ukrainian crisis in terms of how countries now perceive where money goes to when it comes to security and defense. And in relation to the peace building initiatives funded by either the US or the EU, if that same logic is applied, how would that affect? For example, I think it was last year. There was a new tools. Financial structure was set up such that money does not go into directly through the EU, rather now goes directly to states. So, like initiatives like this that are ongoing, what will it last? What will be the implication? How will it affect the EU? The EU relations with African countries, the interventions. If attention is paid to the fact that state funds rarely go to peace building, they go to other things, and when the problem arises, they then look towards the EU or the US for help. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to start with Christina's question about China, but before listening from our European panelists here, how they think the war has changed European countries' perception of China. Would like first to ask Medelina whether the war has somehow impacted also the perception of China and especially US-China rivalry in East Asian countries.
Yeah, I think this is as we know in ASEAN there are two hotspots. One is South China Sea, and the second one is cross-strait relation between China and Taiwan. And I think now is the question. I mean, the profound issue is whether China will do. Replicate what Russia doing towards the regions that, according to China, is inseparable part of the mainland, which is Taiwan. And the fear is if this trigger open conflict, then will jeopardize the neutrality and position of the Southeast Asia. And then how then Southeast Asia countries as a collective, as a regional organization will react to that. So I think this kind of discussion, if it's the situation in Russia now, it's also happened. I think then will bring superpowers if China making an action in the related to cross-strait relation. China, it would invite also the US to coming to the region. I think it's the most important issue at the moment.
Bottom line, you are more worried now than you were before the war.
Yeah, because it seems there is an example there, and then maybe it's just immediate the example there bringing the issue to the Southeast Asia region.
Bruno, you have to leave in 10 minutes, I guess. So I would go to you for the question about China, but also pose question about something you actually mentioned before, that we should not take for granted that a functionalist need for more cooperation in Europe will actually translate in a political willingness to do that. There might be strong resistance. One resistance I identified some time ago is that this war has enacted a slight shift in the balance of power within the EU, with Northeast axis now being more prominent, more influential than it was before, and France and Germany a bit less than they were before. And this might actually create a backlash perhaps in France or Germany or Italy and other countries. So what are your thoughts? You have
on that latter point, no, I think this is pretty much nonsense. I mean, it hasn't changed the relative economic and military weight in Europe. It has not changed the voting rights into the EU. I'm sorry, but Germany, France, and Italy will remain the biggest players. I'm sorry, but as much as I understand,
you don't have to be sorry. I mean,
I'm sorry because I'm sorry because this is sometimes presented as a fact that Central Europe will become, by mere virtue of having frontline states and are much more committed to the immediate defense and support of Ukraine than countries in the most countries in the second tier, except for the UK, of course, but the UK is no longer in the EU. I fail to see how, the balance for this power shifting, like, for me, it's bad journalism, if I may. I'm not saying that it's your expression, but you're right to ask the question. And I said, how does it translate? Why would it translate into, I don't see it. Okay. The economic realities will still be there. Now, whether Berlin and Paris should take more attention to the views expressed by the Baltic states and the Poles, among others. That's for sure. That's for sure. That should be a net effect. There's that tiny little problem of Hungary, by the way. When people talk about, oh, Central Europe in the front line resisting against Russia. Yeah, remind me about Hungary. There's a slight Hungarian problem. I mean, and by the way, we all have our police forces in the case, so that may also develop. I'm not really qualified to speak about public opinion versus elite in Europe. Maybe Rosa, I'm sure that Rosa knows much more than I do. On the question of Africa, I mean, again, very quickly, if I may, it's not for us Europeans to say how sovereign African nations should spend their state budget. However, it's always a bit troubling when some countries, and I'm not referring to Ethiopia, when some countries say, oh, now Europeans, you know what it feels to, and why should we care about you, etc., and say, oh, by the way, we still rely on you to manage our security problem. See, there is that mismatch which sometimes, again, it's not about the country that you mentioned. That mismatch is a little bit of a problem for European ears from time to time. That said, I think Europe cannot afford to shift its attention from Russia to Africa. I mean, from Africa to Russia. I mean, it's not an either-or issue. I mean, Africa is our big neighbor. We will always be neighbor. It's like the UK. Sorry, no comparison, but I mean, geography is geography, okay? And geography. That's just one quick point about China and Taiwan, because I don't believe that perception of China has changed because of the Ukraine war. However, I think the perception of the Taiwan question is rapidly evolving in Europe, has evolved a lot in the past 2-3 years. And I think there is much greater understanding that we cannot stay away from the Taiwan question. I'm not going to dwell into that issue at length right now, but in a nutshell, I've written about it. I will write again about it. That one should not expect that the Europeans would be needed militarily, or that would want to be involved militarily. However, that does not mean they should not be involved in deterring China from ceding Taiwan. More at the next episode of our discussion, because it's a huge topic in itself. But because we're talking about the Ukraine war, I don't think that the Ukraine war has changed the perception of the PRC in Europe. But your guess is as good as mine.
Rosa.
Yeah, I mean, for me, before 24th of February, I had assumed that Europe would not want to follow the US wholeheartedly on the China question. And now I'm just watching to see how things change. Less so because of the strategic reassessment of China, but because of a strategic reassessment of the relationship with the United States. And then, of course, the principles piece. And all I'm seeing is that on some issues there is a bit of a hardening of the position of the European position towards China, but I don't know whether that amounts to more than to a shift, or whether it's just small pieces. So on Africa, I'm not sure, because I mean, France has withdrawn from Mali, right? I'm very worried about the bandwidth of Europe, actually, and I'm very worried. And Putin has made no secrets that he could turn the tap. Erdogan has done that as well, and provoke a migration, a refugee outflow from Africa, from the Middle East. I'm a little bit concerned about that, because Europe doesn't have the bandwidth, because it just doesn't, and the attention. So we talked about the countries that are most committed and are on the front line with respect to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They're not particularly interested in what's happening in Africa, and that's one of the problems. And that is, that you don't have a common perception of what the threat is. Of course, the fact that Russia is in Africa, I think that is increasingly on the minds of practitioners, Russia and China, and the degree to which these countries become another terrain for the confrontation is important. Now, the gaps, elites, and publics. I mean, I don't know if, yes, you know better than I do, Professor Zenia, right? Yeah, exactly. I'm looking at you because you'll have the latest data I mean, there's a number of levels here. The first is there's always been a big gap between elites and publics on European issues, and I think perhaps now, but here this is where I turn to you. I think it might even be narrower than it usually is. So I think there might even be a little bit more alignment, despite the fact that all the countries in Europe have issues with Eurosceptic parties. Some are far right parties, some are far left parties, some are, simply populist parties. So there is an issue of Euroscepticism, but I'm not sure that that gap is growing.
This is the time to bring in the Italian election. Not based on the financial plans of the other day.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think post-COVID, the relevance of the EU in solving problems has actually become more evident to publics, and therefore the debate about Europe is different. It's more part of the domestic debate, and it's not just that thing out there. So that would be my first point. My second, it's just an observation, and I don't have an answer as to why this has been the case, but I've been struck by the lack of public discourse on part of political leaders about the war and about the need, we all need to, to group together and fight this. I've been, I think Ursula von der Leyen's speech last week was actually perhaps the one speech. I don't know if Macron maybe made some other speeches quite recently about, but I mean, okay, I haven't read, so. But that we haven't really seen European politicians saying, this is the moment in which we all need to unite, and I haven't seen that, and I've been wondering why that is. I mean, is it because it's just too much of a sort of construct to talk about, an abstract construct to talk about united Europe? Is it because the political class does not express that kind of rhetoric or rhetorical abilities? Yes, maybe, but I haven't seen that, and I've been quite struck. Or is it simply an recognition that we have volatile, polarized debates, and there's no narrative that can be that unifying? Actually, you have to speak to different audiences in different ways, and I don't know what the answer is. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, it might be even the fact that EU leaders have, I mean, with some exceptions, perhaps Macron is the one exception that comes to mind, and Ursula von der Leyen too, is that EU leaders have not been in that position of being in the need to express how topical, how epochal the moment we are presiding is. This is the first time they have come to terms with a systemic transformation we haven't seen in 30 years, and they are just, their mindset is just shaped differently, and they are perhaps still in the process of adapting, and perhaps a next generation of leaders will speak a different language. It might not be that impossible, in my opinion. But it is interesting your point about the narrowing gap between publics and elites on Europe. I mean, I did mention the Italian election, not by chance. We are most likely going to, as a government, a right-wing government, the most right-wing government in Italy's history, in Italy's Republican history, of course. If I told you 5 years ago that we would have a government run by Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy and Salvini's League and Berlusconi's Forza Italia as the junior party, you would have told me, well, Europe is in a big Europe would be in big trouble then. And this is not what we anticipate. Of course, the next government will not be as pro-EU as the Draghi government has been, not as proactive, not as authoritative for sure, but it will not be as troubling as it would have been if it had come to power some years ago. The war has changed that, and the discourse has changed. But Olexiy,
can I just say one thing about speeches? I think Macron is probably the only leader who does engage in rhetoric, and apart from the UNGA, I have read a lot of his speeches. It's amazing how, you know, they're long, they're like 30 pages of dense words, right? But I don't think French people are particularly taken by them. Exactly. So it's, you know, it's the EU bubble. They read it because he's the only leader who talks about Europe and has these grand visions. But I don't think the French public do.
On China, look, Chinese official position was always in favor of territorial integrity of Ukraine, and it's clear why. And China didn't recognize annexation of Crimea and withdraw its investment from Crimea after Russian occupation. But what happened on the eve of February 24th, it's clear. Putin was in Peking and Beijing basically gave the green light for the aggression. That's clear. There was this joint declaration of friendship without limits. So
It's not that clear, actually.
it's, well, maybe you know some, well, but basically, for me, for many experts in Ukraine and outside Ukraine, it's clear that without Chinese approval, Putin would not go for that. At least he managed to sell to Xi that Russia would be victorious in 3 days. And he said, okay, let's go with it. But it didn't happen. So we may say that Ukrainian resistance and Western support to Ukraine actually defended Taiwan for a while. Because if Putin is successful in Ukraine, then if the West is weak again, as it was in Afghanistan, then China may go for Taiwan. So I think what we see in Ukraine and the position and the unity of the West is very important for Taiwan as well. And just one anecdotal interesting story about Africa. So yesterday I was on the flight from Warsaw to Paris. Guess whom I met on the flight? This is about Russia and Africa. I met Russian mercenaries who boarded in Warsaw, and we are flying via Paris to Niger. Okay.
Niger.
What is the English pronunciation?
Niger. Yeah.
Niger. Okay. Yeah. So for me, it's very interesting, you know, because we know all these limits to Russians coming inside, but Russian mercenaries, you know,
Russian mercenaries boarded a flight to Niger from Warsaw.
I do not know how did they get to Warsaw. That's interesting as well, but they boarded the flight. Warsaw via Paris to Niger. So just, you know, to think, share this information with, you know, who. Okay.
So we have 10 minutes left. I have one last question here and one there. Gilan and Oliver. Anyone else? So this will be the last questions.
Oliver from the GMF. Let me open up a new chapter 8 in the discussion. It's about the role of Turkey. As we have all witnessed in the last month, they have been critical in forging that grain deal. They have been critical in opening up, keeping open lines to Moscow in any diplomatic means. But they play a very, very critical role when it comes to potential conflict in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's a powder keg we probably turn a blind eye on regarding the crisis with Greece, the old sovereign crisis. They just recently announced that they're going to join the Shanghai Cooperation Council, not only leaning back as an observer. They're critical when it comes to the Montreux Treaty and ruling the access to the Black Sea for any actor in the region and beyond that. Is this just a window dressing exercise of Erdogan because of the upcoming election in his country, presidential election, or do we have to take this more seriously? It's a question to Rosa particularly, but also to you as a Mediterranean expert.
Thank you. You want to intervene on this?
Thank you, Riccardo. My name is Gilang Kambara. I'm a researcher at the CSIS in Indonesia, from Jakarta. So I have a question for Dr. Balfour. I think I'm quite intrigued by your notion that bandwidth from West and also Europe is decreasing, and that Europeans' immediate security concern will be seen from Africa and Middle East in terms of the flow of migration and energy flow and etc. And I've been saying to myself and also to a number of colleagues that since the financial crisis of 2007 until, well, for Europe it's 2012 so, had it not because of Russia and Crimea and various other issues such as migration crisis, I'd say that Europe would be much more fixated with Indo-Pacific strategy much earlier because it would be able to position its resources towards the area. But because of what events transpire, we see that the Indo-Pacific strategy has only been introduced in the past 1 or 2 years or so. So my question, I suppose, goes in a way that whether or not does the European Union Indo-Pacific strategy is some of a way to offset the Europeans' immediate security concern in Africa and Middle East so that it gains the opportunities tapped within the center of growth and development in Indo-Pacific. Could it be sort of flowed or channeled towards Europe, these security concerns over in Middle East and Africa in any means that you can sort of define yourself, or whether or not these policies, Indo-Pacific, Middle East, Africa, Europe's policies in these regions should be viewed on a separate term and separate basis. Thank you.
Perhaps I may address the question about Turkey. Although, I mean, I will just give you my first impression, my general assessment of it. I mean, under Erdogan, Turkey has undergone a series of transformations, and not always, and the trajectory has not always been a linear one. But at this stage, I would say that Erdogan has developed a deep mistrust of the West, of the EU and the US, especially since 2016, the failed coup. It has developed sort of greater affinity in terms of worldviews with non-European, non-American leaders. He very much buys into the story of multipolarity or multicentric international relations, both because of his distrust of the US and Europe, but also because he wants Turkey to be one of the centers. And to an extent, he has managed to make Turkey a quite pivotal country in a number of regions that are now increasingly connected: Europe and the Caucasus, Eurasia and Central Asia and Southeast Asia. So Turkey is, to an extent, present everywhere. Is a member, is a NATO member, and it's quite an important one. It is still an EU candidate, although the process is basically stalled. It has been stalled for many years, but still it has a very deep economic and economic relationship with the EU, and there is an institutional basis on which that economic relationship can actually be keep further strengthened and intensified. So even if the accession talks are stalled, EU-Turkey relations are still very much relevant to Turkey as they are for the EU. One example was the 2016 migration deal with Germany/EU. Turkey has also become much more influential in the Caucasus, first thanks to its help to Azerbaijan in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, which, by the way, is now tilting ever more towards Azerbaijan and therefore towards Turkey rather than Russia. And the list goes on and on and on: Libya, Syria, East Africa, Djibouti, the Red Sea, relations with Qatar. And Turkey is also betting on improving its relationships with Central Asian countries. It has developed a quite successful connectivity strategy, not in terms of promoting connectivity infrastructures, but certainly Turkish Airlines is a major issue, is a major asset for Turkey because it's the one airline that goes everywhere, especially if you want to go to I don't know, to East Africa or to Central Asia from Europe. You have to, most of the time you have to make a stopover in Istanbul. And this recent participation in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit is telling in that regard. It's not that Turkey wants to turn its back on the West. It wants to pursue this highly effective, at this stage, hedge strategy. Turkey has managed to make itself needed for a number of countries. Even Ukraine and Russia go to Turkey, and Ukraine does not expect Turkey to be as tough on Russia as it expects the EU to be. And that for certain reason, it has paid off for Turkey because, yes, it was first the site of these Ukrainian-Russian, I would call them meetings rather than negotiation talks back in March. But those failed, but not because of Turkey's, not because of Turkey. And Turkey was critical in ensuring the deal on wheat and food. And that is going to have an impact. And countries around the world and governments around the world will remember that. And Erdogan is also very much aware that the West do not trust him, just as much as he doesn't trust the West. And there is a chance, I would call it very remote, but there is a chance of a breakdown in relations between the EU/the US and Turkey, especially if Turkey keeps on regressing from democratic and rule of law standards. And by embracing the concept of having an extensive platform for dialogue and cooperation with Central Asian countries like the SCO countries, or even considering applying for membership in the BRICS format, or extending its ties with Gulf countries, especially Arab Gulf countries, but also Iran. Turkey is basically saying, I have other options. And when a country has other options, it has a more powerful negotiating strategy, and the West will have to take account of that. So I think I've synthesized my point about Turkey. Rosa.
The weak point is Turkish economy.
Yeah, please.
No, I'm just throwing an argument to you. Counter argument.
Yeah,
the weak point is Turkish economy.
Yeah. That for sure too.
Yeah, I mean,
it's actually the weak point.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow through, agreeing with you and also with you. I mean, it's quite extraordinary what Turkey's managed to achieve in these past few years of foreign policy adventurism. But Erdogan is really bad at monetary policy. And I was in Istanbul in June, and I've never been in an environment where Turks were so openly speaking so openly against Erdogan. And for the first time, people were confident that he might not win the elections next year. What happens after that, if that were to be the case, is another question. But yeah, so the economy, the inflation. Right.
Indo-Pacific.
I think there's a hell of a lot in that question. So I think this is how I'm going to answer it. We should not assume that the European Union develops strategies or policies or partnerships or whatever you want to call them, because they've all got different names, following a very clear strategic vision. What we should assume is that the foreign policy system is one in which there's several push and point entry points. I've called them in the past sort of coalitions of policy entrepreneurs who push for certain strategies to be developed, and sometimes they're more successful than others. And ditto on where there is a bit more coherence, which has been on the regional fronts. There is a sort of enlargement blueprint, which was then translated into the neighborhood policy, Eastern Partnership, etc., etc. There was an idea there. But even there, the balance between East and South was always one that was subject to careful negotiation between the member states, between, the various actors who are influencing the system. And I would say very much the same with respect to parts of the world which are further away. So Spain has always been active, and Christy's still here. I mean, we did 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, we did a study on member states and the External Action Service, and we sort of categorized how member states use the system to push for their interests.